Well, good morning. We're delighted you're here with us for the 14th Annual Humanities Montana Festival of the Book. Without any further ado, I know you'll want to meet Joan and hear her fascinating story. So Joan Bird is our author today. She moved to Montana to pursue graduate studies in zoology at the University of Montana. In 1983, she completed her PhD on inter-island variation in West Indies finches. Joan has worked as a conservation biologist for the Montana Environmental Information Center, the Nature Conservancy, and the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. She has also worked as a fire lookout in both Washington and Montana states. Her writing career includes numerous articles for scientific and conservation publications, and she was a participant in the 1995 University of Montana Environmental Writing Institute at the Teller Wildlife Refuge with Wendell Berry. Joan also has a long history in women's issues and has been a columnist, essay writer for Crone magazine for the last 5 years. She is the author of the new book, Montana UFOs and Extraterrestrials, and is working on a sequel. Please welcome Joan Bird.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming at this fairly early hour for this town, especially you young people that I know are probably out taking advantage of all the activities that Missoula has to offer on a Friday night. And I imbibed a little myself at the Union Club. There was a great reggae band down there last night. So it's nice to be back in Missoula. I have some past lives in Missoula, so spent a lot of years here, quite a few years ago, and it's a little bit interesting. It was interesting to think about coming back. I think the last time I spoke in Missoula was probably for my thesis defense. So, and those were, I mean, they were good years, but there was also some pain involved, so thinking about coming back and presenting on a very different topic was a little bit unnerving. But this has become my primary area of focus and interest and passion in communicating to the world about a subject that is not always easy to talk about and which there is a lot of resistance in some quarters to hearing this information, which is part of why I feel motivated, I guess, to work on bringing this material to a wider audience. I know that you could have been all kinds of wonderful places this morning. It's a beautiful day outside. You could have been chasing bird dogs. You could have been canning your tomatoes. You could be at the farmer's market, or you could be enjoying a quiet, lazy morning at home. So thank you so much for coming out this morning. I'm very grateful to see a good audience here and appreciative. So how do I get from being a conservation biologist to being interested in UFOs? I was a skeptic. I had become convinced by the Condon Report, which came out in 1968, that this was not really something that we should pay any attention to. Like most of the people, I was vaguely aware that a study was going on at the University of Colorado with very highly credentialed scientists to investigate the matter, and I was interested. But when they came out with a summary, and most of the papers, all they did was include the summary of the Condon Report, Edward Condon concluded that we were not being visited, and that was the primary headline that we saw in newspapers all across the country. We're not being visited. Get over it. Forget it. The people that looked more closely than the introduction at the Condon Report realized that 28% of the cases that they looked at were unexplained. Some of them were very convincing. However, Edward Condon decided not to talk about that in his summary of the report. And that was all that I had paid attention to, was the summary. We're not being visited. And I had gone on to do graduate work and was thoroughly immersed in conservation biology and orthodox evolutionary theory. So this wasn't something that I really paid too much attention to until I kind of took a career turn and became more and more interested in doing writing. And I had made a mental note when I was working for, I think it was Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, about an article that came out in 1998 in the Helena Independent Record, which talked about a crop circle that had occurred up in northwestern Montana. And I clipped it out. I thought, well, that's kind of curious. I've heard something about these crop circles. I don't know much about them. But I was talking to a friend of mine who was the editor of a magazine, and she was interested in the topic, and I said, well, I'll investigate it. And she said, if you write it up, we'll put it in the magazine. So in early 1999, I started looking at that crop circle. I wanted to do an article about cereal mystery, because these usually occur in cereal crops. And what's interesting about the crop circles is that oftentimes it's not just a single crop circle itself that is interesting, but in England it might be what happens in that field the next year that relates to the one the year before. So it is kind of a cereal mystery, and that happened actually in Montana as well. This was the first crop circle. It happened in 1998, August 28th. That highway that you can see on the top of the photo there is Highway 93. It's just a couple of miles north of Kalispell and quite close to what was Flathead Valley Community College at the time. By the time that I got around to investigating this, it was the following spring. I contacted Tom Lawrence, who was the editor of the Whitefish Pilot and who had investigated this particular crop circle. He had found twine and pegs in the field. And because it was so close to the community college, he also told me that in the week before it happened, that the Discovery Channel had shown this documentary on crop circles where they highlighted Doug and Dave. Anybody that's paid attention to crop circles has heard the Doug and Dave story. A lot of people got the Doug and Dave story and they wrote it off and said, well, we don't need to, that's explained now. Doug and Dave used ropes and boards, and they went out there, and these guys were in their 60s when they claimed that they were making all the crop circles. They do this technique. And curiously, though, their wives weren't even aware that they were doing this, and one of the crop circles appeared while they were on a television program. So it became apparent to anybody that looked very closely that they weren't making all of them. But there were a lot of crop circles out there that were being made by humans, and that was Tom Lawrence's conclusion. And based on the evidence, I think that that was a reasonable conclusion. However, when I began to look into crop circles and reading about the English crop circles, what I learned is that there's been some very good biology done on the plants within crop circles, and very good science. And actually, the BLT research team, one of their authors put together some scientific articles that were published in Plant Physiology about the changes in the plants that happen within the crop circle formation. And it turns out that these cereal crops, that the joints or nodes in the plant stems are elongated, and in some cases there are holes that are blown in those nodes from some kind of superheating of the liquid in the plant. And you don't get those things with boards and ropes. You don't get those from mechanical mashing. But one of the most convincing pieces of science that I saw was an analysis of the soils that was done on a crop circle in Alberta not too long after the Montana crop circles. I think it was actually in the year 2000 or maybe 2001. And that study was funded by Lawrence Rockefeller, who had a high level of interest in crop circles and also in UFOs, as it turns out. And what they found was that within the crop circle, the clay particles that where the formation had been created had undergone a crystallization process. And the only way you get that crystallization process is by firing clay, as in pottery, or by millions of years of eras of geological pressure and superheating that creates that transformation of the particles into clay particles. So they had collected the plant samples. They'd had an analysis that was done. The statistical analysis was done by people that were not aware of of the fact that it was a crop circle. They were just given these different soil samples from within, without the crop circle, asked to compare them, asked to measure the amount of crystallization, and then analyze the data statistically. And then the results were sent to the man who is probably the expert on clay. He's a earth minerals expert at Dartmouth. And his conclusion was that these are energies that are unknown. We don't know what created this. So that had convinced me that there was something else going on besides mashing. And in the following year, there was another crop circle. And by that time, there were people up there in the area that had looked at the first crop circle and begun doing their own investigation and found out about the BLT research team. And so when this crop circle happened, this happened actually, it's known as the Blue Moon Corner, which is right where Highway 2 hits, I think it's 83, that goes between Whitefish over to Columbia Falls. It's about 5 miles north and east of the first crop circle. And this is the only photo that was ever taken of it. I apologize, it's not any better, but you can see that it's similar. It is that circle that's divided into 4 parts, which is a traditional medicine wheel in a lot of Native American traditions. It's quite similar to the Zuni Pueblo sun symbol, which is displayed on the New Mexican flag. And the meanings of the different directions vary from tribe to tribe. But you can see that this particular image does not have the same. This one is symmetric. It's got the 3 prongs out the cardinal directions. This one does not have any prongs out to the south, to the left there. It looks like there might only be 1 prong to the north, but it does have the 3 prongs east and west. So the interpretation of that, I think, is something that is worth looking at. At the very least, we can say that it's not symmetric. The medicine wheel is a symbol of balance and balancing the different aspects of our lives and reality. So at the very least, maybe we can say something's out of balance. And they were able to get the plant samples, and they were able to see some strange effects, the elongation of the nodes in the cereal crop, in the wheat in this case, within the formation, and outside the formation, not seeing those effects. So we're pretty sure that this one was not made by humans. In the year 2000, there were 2 crop circles. This first one was just about, I think it was also just about 4 miles north of Kalispell, and my understanding is that it was west of Highway 93. The woman who discovered it, she called it Mercedes Spins. It's also a crop circle where they found these unusual effects, and when they flew over it, the pilot noticed that his compass was jumped as he flew over it, which is something else that they find, that these unusual energies seem to affect compasses. And the woman who went into the field, her camera batteries were drained in very short order, which is also something that happens quite commonly. Within whatever this field, this electromagnetic field that's producing these crop circles is doing, it does affect electrical equipment. And a lot of electrical equipment has been done in by crop circles. And people have other interesting effects. Some people walk into the crop circles and will feel ill. They'll get headaches, or they'll feel sick at their stomach. Other people will walk into them and feel euphoric. There have been people that say that they've been healed of things when they've walked into these crop circles. So there's a lot of interesting things that go on in association with this phenomenon. The people that have investigated this, they look at what these symbols might be, looking at the crop circles as possible communications. Native people think that these are messages that we are being communicated with by someone, by some entity. So they've tried to look at what these messages might be. This is a very similar crop circle to the one in Montana, as you can see. And this one was subjected to some fairly sophisticated analysis. These are photos from the Independent Crop Circles Research Association website. This is a crop circle research organization that's based in the U.S. It's run by Jeff Wilson, who's probably the best crop circle researcher in the U.S. And this particular crop circle happened in 2003 on Paint Creek Island in Ohio. There's a man named Bert Jansen who is Dutch, and he does a lot of the analyses of underlying geometries that might be displayed in these crop circles. And this is what he did with that Paint Creek Island crop circle. He made a simplified diagram of the image and then started looking at these underlying geometries. And what they find is that there are amazing connections and correlations, and that there are complexities in the creation of these crop circles that you would not see unless you started looking at these geometrical relationships. I'm hoping that some very bright math student someday might want to do an analysis on the Montana crop circles. We don't have the best photos, but I think that they're good enough that somebody could do that. Maybe some gifted and talented high school class, or who knows, maybe a graduate thesis someday in crop circles. And then the last one was this one, and it occurred in the same field, just a little ways away from the one that happened 2 weeks earlier. The image, as you can see, has this circle in the center and these curved lines that in geometry indicate angles. We have the semicircle at the bottom of the photo, which is kind of almost a moon crescent, and then at the top of the photo, it looks like a body that's radiating, perhaps the sun. So the straight line through the circle could very well be a pole for that globe. And so one of the people that has looked at this, who's actually a remote viewer, says that the message is about a pole shift. Some of you may be aware that there are a lot of prophecies out there about the possibility of a pole shift on planet Earth. There is a man named Clyde King, who is a Native American from Canada. And he had crop circles around this same time. He took them to his elders. And they said, yes, these are messages and they are warnings. And we need to pay attention to them. But paying attention to them is not what happened. These crop circles were not reported in any paper in Montana except for the Whitefish Pilot, and that was quite a bit after the fact. The very first one, the one that was explained as a hoax, that one was reported in a number of papers, including the Missoulian and the Independent Record. I'm not sure about other ones. The second year, that one, again, reported only in the Whitefish Pilot. And then the ones in the year 2000 were, I would say, soundly ignored by the press in Montana and nationwide for that matter. There is a researcher named Linda Moulton Howe who has a website called earthfiles.com, and she did do some articles about these crop circles in Montana. But those were the last crop circles that I know of. It's possible that there are other crop circles that have happened since the year 2000 in Montana. Montanans tend to not always talk about everything, especially if it's a little odd, that happens in their backyards. And it could be the case that there are special situations that are required for the formation of crop circles. In England, they are primarily in these limestone areas in southern England around Avebury and Stonehenge. And there are underlying aquifers, and some have suggested that there's a need for that underlying aquifer in order to produce these effects. And it turns out that in the Flathead Valley, that the water table is very close to the surface, and some people say that actually the Flathead River runs all underneath, that most of the Flathead River is not just what you see on the top, but it runs underneath those soils, so that that is available if that's what's needed to produce crop circles. But it's curious to me that there haven't been any since, and one thing I wondered is if the fact that they were so ignored that whoever is making these crop circles maybe just decided to go elsewhere where they were paid more attention to. So that was kind of what got me thinking about things. What happened was that I heard Linda Moulton Howe one night on late night radio. I don't know how many of you might ever listen to Art Bell and Coast to Coast. back in those days, I was totally unaware, but my husband came in one night and he was all excited because somebody was talking about crop circles on Art Bell. And we turned on the radio and she had a new book out, Glimpses of Other Realities. I ordered the book, thought it was going to be about crop circles. Turns out it wasn't. Turns out it was mostly about UFOs. And the first chapter was primarily military witnesses who were talking about their sightings, their encounters, and also the fact that this was being covered up. And when I read that chapter, I was astonished to hear these stories. These people were highly credentialed. They stood to lose a lot by talking about the topic, and yet their stories I found quite believable. And when I read those stories, it just kind of took me through a door that I was not even aware was there, into a whole nother reality. I had to stop and say, maybe I need to relook at this. Maybe this is something that I have discarded too quickly. So that kind of started my journey. And one of the stories took place in Montana. There was a man named Robert Salas who had been at the base of one of the ICBM Minuteman missiles back in 1967. When the guards started reporting seeing strange lights at a distance that were zigzagging in the sky, and we didn't have any kind of craft that could zigzag like that. So he said to the guards, let me know, keep an eye on it, let me know what happens. And the next thing he knows, the guard's calling him again, very excited, and saying, sir, we have a pulsating red object over the launch control facility. What should we do? And he says, you mean a UFO? And he says, well, I don't know what to call it. And then he says, I've got to go, somebody's been injured. And one of the guards, I guess, was trying to get over the fence or something and scratched himself up. But while he was waiting to hear back from the guards, he looked at all of his control panels. The people in the launch control facility were in charge of being able to launch those missiles at a minute's notice, actually 30 seconds, if they were ordered to do so. And their job was to make sure that those missiles were always ready to go. And the no-go lights started coming on the 10 missiles in the flight that he was in charge of. And this happened, it actually had happened the week before. There are now about 20 witnesses that say this has happened. And when I first heard about that, I was astonished that this had happened and that it was not more widely known. I've been a peace activist for many years, have a lot of friends that have worked in that field. And whether you're a peace activist or whether you believe that the U.S. needs to be out there, doing military action around the world, this is a significant event. These are our greatest weapons on the planet. And if there are technologies that can come in and disable these weapons of mass destruction, then I thought this was something that more people needed to know about. And that was when I first started thinking about writing a book. I thought maybe, because I was aware that there is this resistance to the topic as a whole and this tendency to dismiss it. For a lot of reasons, it's a very troubling subject. And to really allow it into our consciousness means we have to totally rethink our understanding of the nature of reality, actually. So there are other reasons for wanting to dismiss it besides the fact that we've been given a lot of information that we should dismiss it. So at that point, I began doing more research into the subject and began getting myself into the literature. And I was overwhelmed because the literature is huge. And everybody kind of has their own little piece of idea of what they think is going on. It's like that wonderful teaching story about the elephant and the 7 sages that all were looking at different pieces of it. And the one that was looking at the tail thought it was a rope, and the one that was looking at the leg thought it was a tree trunk. And I guess they were blind, so they could only feel what was going on, which is a good metaphor too. But this subject is much bigger than an elephant and much more complicated. So when you begin to get into the literature, you're dealing with that kind of a of a phenomenon where everybody kind of has their own angle. And it's confusing. So one of the things that I wanted to do, that I really was hoping to do, was create a book that's a good primer, that's a good book for people that haven't looked into the subject for whatever reasons up until now, and been busy with other things, or you believe the debunkers, whatever it was. I wanted to create a book that was helpful, first of all, in establishing the credibility of those that have developed evidence, or do have evidence, of some of the Air Force investigations that have taken place, some history on the whole research on UFOs in the country, and also some of the important events that have happened in Montana. Because I know that as Montanans, we take a lot of pride in being residents of this state, and we like to know what's happened here. And I thought, well, maybe, because I'm going to trust these Montanans to want to know about these events, because everything that's in my book is well known within the UFO community. I had gone to trouble to try to bring more information, to do increasing interviews, and also to untangle some of the webs of information that was contradictory. There was a lot of misinformation in the literature. So I did my best also to make sure that it was a document, a book that would have some historical value, that would be useful in trying to sort through some of the misinformation that gets spread out there in some of the other resource books, and to interview, where possible, people that were concerned with these different events. But mostly I just wanted to help people get into the subject and begin to inform themselves and become more literate, if you will, on the subject, because I think it's going to have a lot of important implications for our future. So many of you probably have heard about the Montana movie, Nick Mariana, and the movie that he took in 1950. It turns out that this movie, 16 seconds of film that he took from the baseball park in Great Falls on August 15th, 1950, is still considered to be one of the best pieces of UFO evidence out there. I was astonished to hear this. I thought that I was going to have this cute little chapter about how the ball team in Great Falls had changed their name from the Selectrics to the Voyagers in 2008. And they have this little fellow named Orbit who has green antennae, and they put him on all of the, the menus. You can get Orbit burgers and Voyager dogs, and it's on all the pennants. And the local people in Great Falls have kind of adopted this story as one of the local legends. Monty Dolak did this wonderful painting in 1985 called Saucers Over the Big Stack. Turns out he grew up in Great Falls, and that was a favorite place to go across the way from the Big Stack, where supposedly Nick Mariana had this sighting. I guess it was a hot date place to go to the parking lot across the way and let's go look for flying saucers, eh? That's what Monty said. But I'm going to let Nick tell his story. He was featured in a documentary in 1956 called UFOs. It's an excellent documentary.
I'll show you the Montana film. This film was shot August the 15th, 1950. It was taken in Great Falls, Montana by Nick Mariana. Immediately after we were notified of the sighting, we sent an intelligence man to get a first-hand report.
My name is Nick Mariana. For the past 6 years, I've been the general manager of a minor league baseball club called the Electrics. We play out of Great Falls, Montana, and are a farm club of the Brooklyn Dodgers. On August 15th, 1950, at Legion Ballpark in Great Falls, Montana, after a couple of hours in the clubhouse office, I went up into the grandstand to call the groundskeeper. As I reached the top of the stairway, I glanced northward to the tall Anaconda Copper Company smokestack to check the direction of the wind from the white smoke. Force of habit, I suppose, because our outfielders use it as an indicator on defensive play. As I looked up, I saw two silvery objects moving swiftly out of the northwest. They appeared to be moving directly south. The objects were very bright and about 10,000 feet in the air. They appeared to be of a bright, shiny metal, like polished silver. Both were the same size and were traveling at the same rate of speed, which was much slower than the jets which shot by shortly after I filmed the discs. Suddenly they stopped. It was then I remembered the camera in the glove compartment of my car. I raced downstairs, yelling for my secretary, Miss Virginia Roney. The distance from the top of the stairway to my car is about 60 feet, and I must have made that in about 6 jumps. I asked my secretary if she saw anything, and she said yes, 2 silvery spheres. I unlocked the glove compartment of my car, took out the camera, turned the telephoto lens on the turret into position, set the camera at f/22, picked up the objects in the viewfinder, and pressed the trigger. The discs appeared to be spinning like a top and were about 50 feet across and about 50 yards apart. I could not see any exhaust, wings, or any kind of fuselage. There was no cabin, no odor, no sound, except I thought I heard a whooshing sound when I first saw them. As the film clicked through the camera, I could see the objects moving southeast behind the General Mills grain building and the black water tank directly south of the ballpark. I filmed the objects until they disappeared into the blue sky behind the water tank.
This is the Montana film, projected exactly as it was photographed. The objects are moving against a 25 to 28 mile an hour wind. This is the film in double frame or slow motion. A slight bounce in the movement of the objects as well as the tower is perceptible. This is due to the handheld camera. The film, analyzed frame by frame, shows the movement of the objects to be horizontal and steady.
We will now vary the action and size of the objects and also stop the action from time to time for your study. We have just made a jump cut in the film to an enlarged size and reversed the action. You are now seeing the objects exactly as they were photographed, but from a closer perspective. Analysis reveals that the objects are not balloons, nor any kind of known aircraft. The images are very different from those produced by any kind of birds at any distance. The shape, brightness, speed, rectilinear path, steady motion, and separation rule out various forms of optical atmospheric mirages or cloud reflections. Comprehensive analysis has eliminated meteors and other known natural phenomena. The possibility of airplane reflection has been carefully studied and ruled out.
So, when they first investigated this film, the Air Force investigation that was happening at that time was Project Grudge. And Project Grudge was very aptly named. Their job was to find an explanation for everything. They'd already made up their minds before they looked at anything. And their explanation was this was aircraft and the sun was glinting off of them. Interestingly enough, there were 2 times in Air Force investigations when the conclusion was arrived at that we were being visited by extraterrestrials. So twice, government conclusions did come up with that result. The first time was in Project Sign, which began in 1948. J. Allen Hynek, who's an important figure in the UFO field I'll talk about later, he was hired. He was an astronomer at Ohio State University, he was the closest astronomer to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is where they did these investigations. But Project Sign was created in 1948, shortly after the Roswell crash. which some of you are probably familiar with, still somewhat controversial, but there have been so many witnesses that have come out, and originally the first Air Force press release was that they had a crashed UFO. So Project Sign was created as a result of this letter from General Twyman. Phenomena reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. It is recommended that headquarters, Army Air Forces, issue a directive assigning a priority security classification and code name for a detailed study of this matter. So that was how Project Sign began. After a year of study, the people in charge of Project Sign came up with an EOTS, and in Air Force language, that's an estimate of the situation. It's kind of their initial report. And their conclusion was that we were being visited by extraterrestrials. They ran it up through the ladder to the top of the hierarchy, and it was rejected as something that could not be released to the public. Eventually, those reports were declassified and destroyed. It's kind of an odd thing to do, but you can't destroy classified documents, so they had to declassify it before they could destroy it, I guess. And the Air Force, if asked about it, will say that it never existed. However, there are a number of people that testify that it did exist, including Captain Ruppelt, who was the one who was in charge of Project Blue Book. Ed Ruppelt was sort of a breath of fresh air in the Air Force investigations. He took his job very seriously. When he came on board to head up Project Blue Book, he got rid of anybody that already was convinced that flying saucers were real, as well as anybody that was convinced that they weren't real. He wanted people that were objective and open-minded. And that was how he went about his study. Blue Book was initiated shortly after the flyovers over Washington, D.C. in 1952, which is another very important event. And that documentary that I showed the clip of, the last portion of that documentary is a dramatization of that flyover, which is a very significant event. A lot of people became convinced that it was real. When I go to UFO conferences, I run into people who say, that's what convinced me. I was there in Washington, D.C. I saw the flyover. I think the official explanation at this point in time is that it was an inversion, because sometimes radar trackings will show up when there's inversions. However, the radar experts at the time, and it's documented in the field, said, no, this was not an inversion. There were 14 objects out there in space, and they were also being reported by pilots that had been set up to scramble them. So that got the attention of a lot of people in the Air Force. And the Air Force was a mix. It was a mix of people who believed and thought the public should know, or who believed and thought, no way, we should never let the public know about this. It's way too, we are really at effect from the possibility of these technologies, and we can't defend the country against it, so it's better for them not to know. And there were people that just totally dismissed it. They just couldn't allow that into their reality, and were convinced that everybody that was seeing these things was either a poor witness, there was a good explanation for it, or there was some kind of mental problem involved. But Ed Ruppelt, with Blue Book, went about this study, and he presented this film and also another film that was taken by a Navy photographer. His name was Newhouse in Tremonton, Utah, to a panel that was assembled in 1953 to hear the best evidence that Blue Book had come up with. And this panel was known as the Robertson Panel. It turns out that, yes, everybody on the panel was a highly respected and highly credentialed professor, scientist from somewhere in the country. It also turns out in retrospect that they had all been involved with defense projects in some kind or other, and that Robertson himself, who was the head of the panel, was on the payroll of the CIA. And while Ruppelt thought that this was just an expert panel, it turns out that this was actually a CIA event to have a listening to the evidence, but those panel members were instructed that they were supposed to come up with a result of, we don't know what this is. They were given three choices. They were supposed to say either we are being visited by extraterrestrials, or there is no evidence that we're being visited by extraterrestrials, or we don't have enough evidence. And officially they came up with, we don't have enough evidence. But Ed Ruppelt and a number of people who did the research on the project and who came to the conclusion that you could not explain the Mariana footage by aircraft, and that the Tremont and Utah video by Newhouse could not have been birds. They presented this as their best evidence, and yet the Robertson panel said, well, that can't be the case. And there's a man named J. Allen Hynek who was first enlisted by Project Sign in 1948, and he worked for these Air Force investigations all the way through the end of Project Blue Book in 1969. And he was a very bright man. He early on made a name for himself in studying stellar evolution, how stars go through different phases in their life histories. And he also was somebody who developed satellite tracking technologies with Harvard astronomers. He was stationed at Harvard for a while. And then eventually he became head of the astronomy department at Northwestern University in Chicago and was in charge of the observatory there. And Hynek sat in on this Robertson panel. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what he had to say about that panel.
The CIA now would enter the picture by convening a panel of top scientists to examine the UFO phenomena. The CIA's concern was that recent waves of sightings might constitute a threat to our national security.
It's Rod Serling, for those of you who remember Twilight Zone.
Exploit UFOs as a decoy in the preparation for an attack on the United States. 5 outstanding scientists and various Air Force and CIA representatives were to meet on Wednesday, January 14th, 1953. Among the panel members was one associate member who was destined to have more experience with the UFO phenomena than any other American scientist to date. Dr. J. Allen Hynek,
a retrospective,
astrophysicist and head of the astronomy department of Northwestern University.
As he was thinking back on
I was
1953.
called into the meeting on Thursday. The panel members were seated around this table. It was a rather somber and impressive occasion, actually. I was a junior member, and I remember feeling considerably nervous and apprehensive about being in front of this powerhouse of scientists. But then for the past 4 years, I had been scientific advisor to the U.S. Air Force on this very problem. There were 2 films that were of particular interest to the panel at that time. One was a film taken by a Navy officer while on vacation in Utah, near Tremont, Utah, and the other was a film taken in Great Falls, Montana, by the owner of the local baseball team. The Utah film had already been subjected to some 1,000 or so man-hours of analysis by the Navy's Photographic Interpretation Laboratory. So the panel got up from their chairs and crouched around the wall to examine the films, and they asked to have the films run several times, as a matter of fact. Now, the Navy had, on the basis of their detailed analysis of the Utah films, they had concluded that the objects shown in the films could not be birds, balloons, aircraft, and so forth, but indeed that they were self-luminous, unidentified objects.
Can you hear that? Self-luminous, unidentified objects.
The panel rejected it.
Yeah, I don't know how to get it up any higher. Sorry.
They couldn't be unidentified, therefore they had to be birds.
They couldn't be unidentified, therefore they had to be
I
birds.
came away from the meeting and from the room with the distinct feeling, however, that the panel had deliberately moved to debunk the whole subject and not to give it the serious scientific attention which it deserved.
I'm sorry that I'm going to have to figure out how to get the volume up on that, but what he says is that the Navy analysis laboratories came to the conclusion that these could not be birds, that they were self-luminous objects. And yet the Robertson panel concluded that they were seagulls. And, interestingly enough, in both cases, both Newhouse and Mariana, when they submitted their films to the Air Force, what they got back from the Air Force was not what they had submitted to the Air Force. Mariana and many other witnesses that had seen the films before he had sent them to the Air Force or handed them over when the Air Force came to collect them, testified that the best footage was gone, the footage of the objects hovering and the footage when the objects were closest to the camera. So what you saw there was just the footage that's left. And I think that whoever did the editing on the film clip thought that what was left could be explained as jet aircraft. But Ruppelt did the analysis and concluded that it could not be jet aircraft. And then sometime later, actually when the documentary was created, the UFOs documentary, and then later on, when there was a panel before, there was a Senate Congressional Investigation Committee, there was a man named Baker who put together a report that was published in the Astrophysical, Science of Astrophysics, I believe it is, journal, which said that this could not be aircraft because since it goes behind the water tower and the grain elevator, you can figure out what the relative speed is. And if it was jets, they would have had to have been close enough that you could make out the fact that they were jets. The fact that the objects are kind of blurry and not real distinct meant they had to be far away enough that they were going way too fast for what the jets at the time were capable of doing. So the final analysis was that it could not be jets. This is a Project Grudge era document in which the man who received the film from Mr. Mariana, which is marked out with X's, they were trying to conceal his identity in the Air Force document, tells him exactly what he is to say to Mariana when he's trying to get the films from him. And as soon as they heard about the films, they wanted very much to get them in their possession. And after they had them, there was another memorandum. This is what the memorandum looks like. It was declassified just in July of 2011 when Obama was elected president. One of the things that he did was establish a declassification office because there are 400 million classified documents. And he also set a rule that no longer could any document remain classified forever. And he established this office to begin declassifying documents. So there were a couple of documents that were declassified from these Project Grudge era days that pertained directly, I believe, to the Mariana case. And this particular memorandum, there's a section in it where I've rewritten it here, where it says that, number 5, the Intelligence Department Air Materiel Command was further advised that should results of such incidents contain information of any technical intelligence value, they should not be released, but should be sent to DI, the Director of Intelligence Headquarters, U.S. Air Force. So if they had footage of a film of a hovering object that could then travel at the speeds that this did, that would have been, I believe, significant technical intelligence value. And perhaps that was the reason that that particular piece of the film didn't come back to Mariana. And that also happened to Newhouse. He never got his original footage back. He was given a copy. And as he said, the best footage, the closest up footage was missing, which made it a little easier to call it seagulls. Let's see. Whoops. There we go. So, the beginning of every game now in Great Falls, when the Voyagers are playing, Orbit circles the ballpark on his scooter, and they play the theme from Star Wars. So I already talked quite a bit about the Minuteman missiles. That was the chapter following the Mariana chapter. Another interesting event that happened in Montana was this Canyon Ferry sighting, which I became convinced was a hoax. It happened right before Vigilante Parade Days in Helena, which is a big event that happens, I think it's the first Friday in every May, where all of the high school kids get the day off, and they get the previous day off to make floats, something pertaining to Montana history. But I think at some point school teachers many years ago decided that the attention span of their high school students in May was getting shorter and shorter, and they needed to figure out another way to try to get these ideas across. So they created this event, the Vigilante Parade. And this Canyon Ferry sighting actually happened on Wednesday night, the night before the day off that the high school students had. And there were some curious descriptions about the sighting, that the holes that supposedly the craft had depressed in the ground, there were little piles of dirt next to them, and the center of the area with the holes was burned, and it appeared to have some smell of gasoline. So I was convinced that, yes, it probably was a hoax. But what's interesting about it is that the fellow that I talked to said, yes, but we'd heard it on KOMA radio. And I don't know, most of you in this room aren't old enough to remember KOMA radio, but back in this happened in '63. Back in those days, this was one of the first rock stations, and it had a huge coverage. And even out here in Montana, late at night, you could pick up that rock station. So any teens that were with it, they were listening to KOMA radio. And it was broadcast that there had been this sighting in Socorro, New Mexico. And what's significant about the Socorro sighting is that the witnesses were incredibly well credentialed. They were police officers. There were multiple witnesses. And J. Allen Hynek investigated this case. And over time, beginning with in 1948, when J. Allen Hynek was first signed on as an advisor, he was a debunker. When they first approached him, he said, yeah, I think this is all nonsense. I think that there's an explanation for all this UFO stuff, and it's just ridiculous. So that was one of the reasons they hired him, is because he was a total non-believer, a total skeptic. And for many years, he was a very good debunker. But he began to be concerned about the fact that the government was dismissing things, and he was also concerned about the ridicule factor. One of the things that happened after the Robertson panel came to their conclusion was that people were way too interested in this phenomenon, and they needed to figure out how they could dampen down the interest. So the Robertson panel actually proposed that they put together a group of advisors, and this would include celebrities, scientists, media people, and psychologists, to convince the public that every sighting could be explained, and that anybody that had these sightings, there might be some reason that they were needing to make this up. So Hynek thought that that was a little bit over the top. He didn't like how ridicule was brought in to help suppress this information. And after he had worked in investigating sightings for about 8 years, he began to realize that there were just too many cases with very good witnesses that everything could not be explained. And eventually, he became a believer. And because he was right there investigating this for so many years and was so highly esteemed as an astronomer, I think that that says a lot about the topic as a whole. And this particular case he calls the Rosetta Stone. This was the case that really turned him around publicly, where he was saying, I do not have an explanation for this. And he also said at the time, and I included this quote in the book because I thought it was so interesting, talked about how it was one thing to be seeing these UFOs up in the air. It was another thing when you actually could see that there were occupants on those craft, and how hard that was for him to make that jump, to realize that, good grief, yeah, not only are they here, but there are beings in them that are coming from somewhere else. And this particular case, there were 2 occupants of the craft. They were smaller than human size. He was able to hear these descriptions firsthand from this very well-credentialed and highly thought-of police officer. So he thought that this was a very significant case. So I think it's interesting that that was the case that was chosen to be hoaxed by some local Montana folks, and it's a good part of the UFO story. My last 2 chapters in the book are chapters about people that have had contact cases in Montana, and what's interesting about them is that these cases are from a long time ago. Leo Dvorak had his first sighting in 1932, just over the border in North Dakota. And over his lifetime, he had several different contact events in which he was actually able to go on board the spaceship. He's written a book about this called UFOs Are With Us, Take My Word. I met Leo shortly before his book came out and heard a lot of his stories. When I first met him, he was a very kind of hard-edged, cynical guy and suspicious of me and I think most people because he had been disbelieved for most of his life. But when his book came out, it was like he was finally validated, and he kind of went through a personality change to at last be affirmed in these amazing experiences that he had had that he could talk about. A lot of people think that the UFO events didn't really start happening until the late 40s, but as we have investigated more and more, we're realizing that this has been going on for a very long time. And then there was Yuta Wartna, who had his encounter with a craft just outside of Helena, up Confederate Gulch. And he did not write up this story of his account until the energy crisis happened in the 70s. He had thought it was something that was just kind of his personal event. They had told him that he wouldn't believe until he was an old man. But when the energy crisis happened, he felt like he might have some answers to solving that problem that the society was facing. So he wrote a letter to John Glenn and told him about what had happened to him. So this is also considered to be an important historical story, and something that I think that more people would be interested in reading, because he thought that he had something to offer to the world was what inspired him to go ahead and write this up. And he did write to a UFO researcher, Stan Friedman, who was still working in the field, but he didn't really have enough information that Stan followed up on it. However, there are a lot of people within ufology who understand that these technologies do have significant relevance to some of the problems that we're facing now. And there are also people who believe that this is one of the primary reasons that at this time that information is still being suppressed, because the fossil fuel industry would probably be put out of business if these ET technologies were available. And a lot of people ask me, well, why would they still be keeping this secret? And I offer that possibility, and a lot of people agree. There's a lot of power and wealth on this planet that has been attributed to the oil industry. So this would significantly change things. And it's one of the reasons that a lot of people are passionate about this subject and wanting to make more people aware. So at this point in time, I guess we can turn that off. I believe that we're getting to the place where there are a lot of vectors impinging on us that are going to be pushing us toward realizing that this is a real phenomenon. First of which is just the fact that there are so many witnesses, not only that have had sightings. I mean, there are millions of people that have had sightings, but there are also getting to be hundreds of thousands of people that have had contact experiences. And as that begins to accumulate, it makes it harder and harder for us to dismiss it. The other thing that's happening is that astrobiology is getting to be this exciting new field in astronomy, and they're having astrobiology conferences. Ever since they discovered the first extrasolar planet in 1995, people have been reconsidering their thoughts about us being the only advanced civilization in the universe. And now that we know that there are over 200 identified planets just in our galaxy alone, we're beginning to also see farther out into space and realizing that there are hundreds of billions of galaxies. And many of the astronomers are saying that there are probably extrasolar planets on every star, which makes hundreds of billions of planets out there. Most astronomers today will say there are probably advanced civilizations somewhere out there. They're still, for whatever reasons, not willing to look at all of the witness testimony and the physical evidence. There's a fair amount of physical evidence as well that they are already here. But there are other components. There's been a lot of concern that this would have a huge impact on religion, and there'd be a lot of resistance from religious quarters. But the Vatican, in 2009, came out with a statement that it's a possibility and it would not be a threat to our theology. How can we place limits on what God can create? And this is what they said. And there were actually spokespeople with the Vatican that made presentations. Monsignor Balducci, he was careful to say this is not the official opinion of the Vatican, but it is my opinion that this is a real phenomenon and that we need to be paying attention to it. And another thing that's happening is that we're seeing in some academic quarters that other people are taking this seriously. There's a man named John Hart who was a professor at Carroll College of Theology. He started the environmental studies program there, and his first book was called Sacred Earth, and it's about all of the passages in the Bible that talk about the need to have reverence for the earth and care for it well. And he himself is just about to finish a book called Cosmic Comments, in which he's talking about the problem of Christian ethics and extraterrestrial contact. I've known John for some time, and I hadn't seen him. He's now working at Boston University. He is in charge of their Christian ethics department there. And I ran into him at the art museum in Helena. Hadn't seen him for a while. He asked me what I was doing. And at that point in time, I was working on the book, and I kind of gulped and said, well, I'm working on this book about Montana UFOs and extraterrestrials. And he said, oh, really? He says, so things have happened in Montana? I said, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's happened in Montana. He says, very interesting. He says, I'm working on a book about Christian ethics and extraterrestrial contact. I said, you're kidding. And it turned out that he had himself had a sighting back in the 80s when there were numerous sightings in the Hudson River Valley and over 200 witnesses. And when I've read his article, he wrote an article for Science and Theology, and he references a number of other people that are thinking about this. So I think that we are coming to the place where we are no longer going to be able to dismiss this evidence or ridicule it out of the picture. The ridicule factor is so potent. We as humans are so sensitive, so vulnerable to ridicule in what we are willing to talk about and what we're even willing to consider. So pushing past that is difficult as I go around and talk about the book, but also just create opportunities for listenings, for people to have safe space to listen, for someone to listen and to affirm what they've said and affirm that they're not crazy and tell them that, yes, and other people have had similar sightings, and yes, that is a commonly reported type of craft. Sometimes people will tear up as they're talking about it and say, I've never said this to anyone. I had a woman tear up and talking about it, and it wasn't even her event. It was somebody else just talking about it in public. It was such a breakthrough for her that it brought tears to her eyes. So that's one of the problems that we need to push through is this whole ridicule factor. It's such a powerful way to control what we think about. So I'm asking everyone to just maybe consider that you might want to look a little more at this topic if you haven't before. I'm guessing I know a lot of you are already deeply into it. There are many wonderful books out there. I wanted to recommend one other book, which just came out shortly after mine. It's written by a woman named Artie Six-Killer Clark, who is a professor emeritus from MSU. She was in the education department. And the book is called Encounters with Star People. Artie is Native. She's Cherokee. And she was in charge of promoting Indian education and working with the tribes to recruit students to MSU. She traveled all over the country, actually, recruiting for MSU and also talking about Indian education and education for Indigenous people. And she had over 700 stories by the time that she retired, and she put 30 of her best stories into this book, and they are jaw-dropping amazing, and it's a very important contribution to the literature. They are all anonymous witnesses, but if you want to continue to learn about this phenomenon, that's one book I would recommend as well.
What was the author's name?
Artie Six-Killer Clark, C-L-A-R-K-E, Encounters with Star People. Maybe they'll bring her someday. So thank you all for coming.
Yes, thank you, Karen. We do have other